The city was alive with its usual Saturday night rhythm, a mix of laughter, car horns, and the clinking of glasses spilling out of bars and restaurants that lined the downtown streets. Neon signs glowed above busy sidewalks, guiding people to their destinations. Among these was a small but well-loved Italian restaurant, known for its warm lighting, soft music, and the smell of fresh herbs that seemed to drift out onto the pavement. Inside, every table was taken, the atmosphere vibrant yet intimate. Couples leaned close across their plates, families passed bread baskets around, and groups of friends filled the room with chatter and bursts of laughter. The restaurant staff moved smoothly between the tables, balancing trays of steaming pasta, pouring wine into waiting glasses, and making sure every guest felt cared for. It looked like nothing could disturb the harmony of the evening. One couple sat by the window, their hands occasionally brushing, as they shared appetizers, smiling as though the rest of the world had disappeared. A family with 2 children laughed together at a corner table, their youngest picking olives off a pizza slice and arranging them into shapes before finally taking a bite. Toward the middle of the room, a group of colleagues celebrated the end of a long work week, glasses raised high as they toasted to small victories. Each table told a different story, but together they created an atmosphere of comfort, joy, and routine. It was the kind of place where strangers could sit near each other and still feel a sense of shared warmth, even if only for the time it took to finish a meal. The decor added to the cozy feeling. Candle flames flickered inside glass holders, casting soft shadows that danced across the wooden walls. Framed photographs of Italian landscapes hung neatly, showing rolling vineyards and quiet cobblestone streets, a sharp contrast to the bustling city just outside the door. Soft instrumental music played in the background, blending seamlessly with the murmur of conversations and the occasional burst of laughter. Nothing about the setting suggested danger. To anyone stepping inside, it seemed like a small pocket of safety away from the noise of the outside world. For the staff, the night was busy but manageable. The host greeted new guests with a smile, offering apologies to those who had to wait for a table. Waiters wove through the crowded floor with practiced ease, balancing heavy trays without spilling a drop. In the kitchen, chefs shouted orders to one another, pans sizzling as sauces thickened and plates were garnished with fresh basil. The rhythm was familiar, the kind of night they had handled countless times before. None of them could have predicted that the ordinary flow of service would soon be interrupted in the most violent way imaginable. For the diners, it was simply another evening out, a chance to enjoy food and company. No one noticed the subtle details that, in hindsight, might have seemed unusual. No one paid attention to the way a few patrons glanced over their shoulders more than once, or how a faint unease hung in the air without explanation. The truth was that people rarely looked for signs of disaster when surrounded by warmth and light. They trusted the walls of the restaurant to keep out the chaos of the city, to protect them in the illusion of safety. As the hours passed, wine bottles were emptied, desserts were shared, and conversations grew more relaxed. Time seemed to move slower within the soft glow of the restaurant, as though the outside world had been momentarily forgotten. It was a space filled with stories of love, family, and friendship. Yet, beneath the calm surface, fate was already moving into place. The tables, the laughter, the clinking glasses, all of it would soon serve as the backdrop for something no one could have imagined. What began as an evening of celebration was silently sliding toward the edge of nightmare, and no one inside could sense just how quickly their peaceful dinner would turn into chaos. The door of the restaurant opened with a soft chime, letting in a gust of cool night air that briefly stirred the candle flames on the tables. Most people didn't notice. They were too absorbed in their food, their conversations, and the cozy warmth inside. Yet for those who did glance toward the entrance, the sight of the lone man stepping in carried an air of quiet disruption. He was dressed simply, in a dark jacket and plain trousers, blending in well enough to escape suspicion. Still, there was something in the way he moved, measured, deliberate, as if every step had been thought through long before he pushed open the door. He paused for a moment, scanning the crowded room, before walking toward the host's stand. His expression was neutral, neither friendly nor unfriendly, and his pale face looked tired, as though he hadn't slept properly in days. The host led him to a small table tucked in the back corner, away from the chatter that filled the center of the dining area. The man nodded politely, slid into his seat, and ordered a drink in a voice barely louder than a whisper. He didn't open the menu, didn't glance at the decor, didn't allow his eyes to wander. Instead, he fixed his attention almost immediately on a table not far from the middle of the room. There, a man in his 30s sat surrounded by friends, their laughter carrying over the clatter of dishes, and the music playing faintly overhead. It was the kind of laughter that filled a space with energy, carefree and genuine. But to the stranger at the back, it seemed to have an entirely different weight. He didn't look away, didn't blink, didn't hide the intensity in his gaze. The staff carried on without noticing. The waiter brought him a glass of water, and later the drink he requested, but the man barely touched either. His fingers rested on the table, drumming lightly in uneven rhythms, before tightening into a fist and relaxing again. It was as though his body was betraying the storm of thoughts swirling inside his mind. Other diners occasionally glanced at him, sensing something about his stillness that seemed out of place, but they quickly returned to their meals. After all, it was easy to dismiss a stranger as simply tired, preoccupied, or shy. No one could have known that his presence in that restaurant was no accident, no coincidence. The group he watched appeared unaware of the attention they had drawn. The man at the center, cheerful and lively, told stories that made his companions laugh harder with every passing minute. Plates of pasta and half-empty glasses of wine surrounded them, signs of a long, enjoyable evening. The stranger's gaze locked on him with an intensity that only grew stronger, like a predator studying its prey. Each small movement, each casual gesture, each careless laugh seemed to deepen the shadow in his expression. Around the room, life continued as usual. A birthday cake was brought out at a nearby table, drawing cheers and applause. A couple near the window clinked their glasses, whispering to one another as the city lights glowed behind them. The restaurant pulsed with warmth and comfort, a small haven in the busy night. And yet, within that haven sat a man whose thoughts were anything but peaceful. To him, the entire scene was a stage, and he had been waiting for this performance to reach its breaking point. Every so often, he shifted in his chair, his restless energy spilling out in the smallest of ways. A hand brushing the rim of his glass, a glance toward the exit, a deep breath that seemed to steady him. But no matter how subtle his movements, his eyes never left the man he had come for. He had planned this evening with care, knowing the target's habits, knowing the likelihood of finding him here, surrounded by friends and unsuspecting strangers. Every laugh the man shared, every bite he took, every sip of wine seemed to tighten the grip of tension, pulling the moment closer to something inevitable. No one else realized what was building in that quiet corner. To them, the stranger was just another diner passing through. But beneath the soft glow of candlelight, behind the hum of music and voices, a dangerous intent was hardening into certainty. The restaurant, full of life and light, had just welcomed its darkest guest. The man who had slipped inside so quietly was not there to eat or to drink. He was there to wait, to watch, and to strike. The night had unfolded so seamlessly that no one could have predicted the sharp turn it was about to take. Plates were being cleared, wine was being poured, and the music drifted on without interruption. For the man at the center table, the evening remained light-hearted, his laughter echoing above the rest, drawing smiles even from tables nearby. The stranger in the back corner sat still, his drink untouched, his eyes locked in place. Every detail seemed to narrow down to this one man, as though the bustling restaurant had faded into a blur around him. The clinking glasses, the scraping forks, the bursts of conversation, they all became background noise to the rhythm of his own quickening heartbeat. Then, with no warning, The tension snapped. Chairs scraped against the floor as the stranger rose abruptly. The movement caught the attention of only a few, but those few felt an instinctive shiver run down their spine. His hand slid inside his jacket, and before confusion could settle into realization, the sharp crack of a gunshot ripped through the air. The sound was louder than anyone could have imagined, bouncing against the walls, silencing laughter mid-breath, freezing conversations in place. In the stunned seconds that followed, the cheerful man at the center table slumped backward in his chair, crimson spreading rapidly across his shirt. A fork slipped from his hand and clattered uselessly to the floor. The restaurant erupted into chaos. Screams tore through the room as chairs toppled and glass shattered against the tile. People dove under tables, clutching their loved ones, some rushing blindly toward the exit in a frantic attempt to escape. The waiters who only minutes ago had been balancing trays now crouched low, their eyes wide with shock. The birthday candles that had been lit at a nearby table flickered as guests ducked. Their celebration turned to terror in an instant. The smell of gunpowder lingered thick in the air, mixing horribly with the aroma of garlic and wine. The shooter didn't move immediately. He stood still, his arm lowered slightly after the shot, his breathing heavy and deliberate. For a moment, he seemed to take in the scene around him. The chaos, the panic, the sight of his target collapsing lifelessly. His face showed no satisfaction, no smile, no visible release of anger. Instead, there was only an eerie calmness, as though this was not an act of rage, but the completion of something he had been carrying for far too long. He stared at the fallen man, unblinking, as if confirming to himself that the deed was done. Guests cowered in silence, afraid to move, afraid to draw attention. Some covered their mouths to stifle sobs, others clutched their phones, but trembled too much to dial for help. The atmosphere that had moments ago been filled with warmth was now charged with dread, every second stretched into unbearable lengths. The stranger turned his head slightly, scanning the room, his eyes sweeping over faces pressed against the floor. He seemed aware of their fear, aware that dozens of witnesses were frozen in place, yet it didn't appear to bother him. For a brief instant, it was as if he wanted them to see, to carry the memory of what had just unfolded. Then, without speaking a word, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped backward, his eyes never straying from the chaos he had created. The weight of silence followed him, broken only by the muffled cries of those too shaken to remain quiet. No one dared to stop him, no one dared to move in his path. He turned toward the door, his step strangely steady against the sound of panic rising behind him. By the time someone found the courage to rush forward to the victim, the shooter was already fading into the night beyond the restaurant's glass doors. The man on the floor remained motionless, the laughter that had once filled the space now replaced by the steady drip of spilled wine and the haunting echo of what had just occurred. In a matter of seconds, the restaurant had transformed from a sanctuary of comfort to a place where fear clung to every corner. What had been a simple evening meal had become the stage for a nightmare none of those present would ever forget. When the police finally arrived, sirens slicing through the night air, the restaurant was in shambles. The once orderly rows of tables and chairs were overturned, dishes shattered across the floor, and the air hung heavy with the metallic tang of blood mingled with spilled wine. Officers pushed through the crowd of shaken diners who had fled into the street, some crying, some speaking frantically, others standing in complete silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Inside, paramedics rushed to the man who had been shot, but it was already too late. His friends hovered nearby, their faces pale, unable to understand how a moment of joy had dissolved into horror within seconds. The gunman was gone, leaving behind nothing but chaos and unanswered questions. Detectives quickly cordoned off the scene, their flashlights scanning every corner for clues. Witnesses were gathered outside, their statements hurriedly taken as they shivered under the weight of memory. Most could only recall the same few details: a lone man in a dark jacket, seated quietly in the back, his eyes fixed on the victim all night. None of them had noticed the tension. None of them had realized that while they enjoyed their meals, a plan for murder had been silently unfolding at one of their tables. The gunman's exit had been so swift and deliberate that he seemed to vanish into the city like a shadow, leaving the officers to wonder if he had already planned his escape long before pulling the trigger. As investigators dug deeper into the life of the victim, a picture began to form that explained the shooter's relentless focus. The man who had died was not simply an innocent diner chosen at random. Years earlier, he had been involved in a business venture that promised wealth and success. He gathered investors, spoke of opportunities, and painted visions of a prosperous future. Yet the project collapsed spectacularly, leaving debts, broken promises, and ruined lives in its wake. Many who had trusted him lost everything: money, homes, even relationships strained beyond repair. Among those left in the rubble was the man who had walked into the restaurant that night. The connection was startling. Records revealed that the shooter had once been one of the most devoted investors, putting in his savings and even borrowing against his future to support the venture. When it all collapsed, he was left with nothing but bills he could not pay and a reputation that dissolved overnight. Friends distanced themselves, his marriage fell apart, and his job prospects dwindled until he was living in near isolation. His grievances had grown quietly, festering into resentment that hardened with each passing year. To most people, he had disappeared into the background of life. But in reality, he had been waiting, watching, and holding on to the memory of the man who had betrayed him. What unsettled investigators most was the level of planning. The shooter had known where the victim would be, what time he often dined out, and which restaurants he frequented. Surveillance footage showed him near the area several times in the weeks leading up to the killing, blending into the crowd as though he were only passing through. His choice of location was no accident. He had chosen a busy restaurant, not despite the witnesses, but perhaps because of them. It was as though he wanted the act to be seen, as though he wanted the victim's final moments to play out before an audience. For the victim's family and friends, the revelation was almost impossible to accept. To them, he had been charismatic, ambitious, someone who pursued big dreams. Yet the investigators' findings painted another side, one of recklessness, deception, and the kind of carelessness that left others destroyed in his wake. The man who had been celebrated at dinner that night had also been the architect of someone else's downfall. The restaurant became more than a crime scene. It became a stage where years of resentment had finally erupted in a single brutal act. The city watched the story unfold with disbelief. News outlets ran headlines about betrayal, broken trust, and revenge carried out in the most public way possible. People wondered if the shooter had meant to escape at all, or if he had simply been buying time before the inevitable pursuit. Either way, the investigation had revealed a chilling truth. This was not a crime of sudden anger, but one born of long-standing obsession. What had seemed random at first was, in fact, the end of a path carefully walked for years, leading to the moment when a quiet corner table became the starting point of chaos. In the days that followed, the city seemed unable to shake the weight of what had happened. The restaurant remained closed, its doors locked, the once inviting glow of its windows replaced by the harsh glare of crime scene tape. People who had once crowded its tables now crossed the street to avoid walking past it, their minds replaying the horrifying headlines that screamed from newspapers and television screens. Customers who had been there that night spoke in trembling voices, some still too shaken to recount every detail. For them, the memory of the gunshot, the chaos, and the sudden silence afterward was something they could not escape, replaying in their minds long after they had fled into the night. Police launched a citywide manhunt for the shooter, combing through surveillance footage, interviewing acquaintances, and following every lead that might narrow down his hiding place. His face was plastered across every television channel, the photograph of a man once unnoticed now burned into the minds of thousands. Tips poured in from people who thought they had seen him at gas stations, bus stops, or walking through neighborhoods, but each sighting turned cold. He seemed to move like smoke, impossible to grasp, slipping further into the shadows of the city. Yet detectives knew he could not vanish completely. A man on the run always left a trace. The turning point came when investigators began to map out the places he had visited in the weeks before the crime. Bank records, phone signals, and grainy security footage painted a path that eventually led them to the outskirts of town. There, in a run-down motel far removed from the bright lights of downtown, they found him. He had rented the room under a false name, but his attempt at disappearing lacked the precision of his crime. The motel manager, uneasy about the man who never left his room and paid in cash, finally recognized his face on the news and made the call. When the police stormed the motel, the shooter offered no resistance. He was found sitting on the edge of the bed, his hands resting on his knees, staring at the wall as though he had been waiting for them. There was no struggle, no attempt to flee, no last burst of defiance. He walked out quietly, his head slightly bowed, surrounded by officers who kept their weapons drawn until the handcuffs were secure. For some, it seemed anticlimactic, the violent storm that had shattered a restaurant ending not with another outburst, but with a silence almost as chilling as the act itself. In court, the man showed no remorse. He sat calmly through the proceedings, speaking little, his eyes fixed straight ahead. When asked why he had done it, his only answer was that his life had been destroyed, and no one had ever been held accountable. To him, the victim was not simply a man but the symbol of everything he had lost. His words shocked some and angered others, especially the family of the man who had been killed. Yet to those who had studied the case, the response only confirmed what they had already suspected. The act had not been impulsive, but the end of years of brooding resentment that had finally spilled over in the most brutal way possible. The restaurant eventually reopened, but it was never the same. Some staff left, unable to return to a place that now carried such heavy memories. Customers came back slowly, but the chatter never reached the same carefree volume it once had. For those who had been there, the sight of the table where it happened, no matter how many times it was rearranged or moved, brought back the sound of that gunshot and the terror that followed. The space became a reminder of how fragile ordinary life could be, how quickly normalcy could shatter it. The story left the city scarred, a reminder of how unresolved grudges and hidden anger could turn into acts that affected not only the people involved, but also complete strangers who had simply chosen the wrong place and time to share a meal. For the diners who survived, the memory would linger for years, a dark shadow cast over what had begun as a perfect evening. What had been meant as a celebration of food, friendship, and love would forever be remembered as the night a dinner turned into a nightmare witnessed by everyone inside.